So this will be a review from what we did on Monday for the people that may still have some questions here. We'll just go over it one more time in case you want to review. Okay, the normal stuff at the beginning here. Remember the anatomical position. It's palms facing forward, arms at the side. All right, planes of the body you're going to have to know. These things basically divide the body. See them here in a sec. So if you look between the blue and the kind of brown here, that's going to be your frontal plane. Divides the body in half, kind of longitudinally from front to back, whereas the midline or sagittal plane, it divides the body in half between left or right. You can also have some sort of parasagittal planes if you want. It divides the body unequally. And then your axial plane, which means basically armpit, divides the body in half, top to bottom. So the important thing to know here is the level of organization of the body and the progression from it. So the basic building block of the body is going to be the cell. It's a living cell. If you group a whole bunch of similar cells together, they form tissue. A lot of tissues together of different types that accomplish a function is an organ. And then an organ system is a system that actually works together to actually accomplish a function. So you can think of things like heart is in the circulatory system, so are your arteries and veins. That's the sort of idea here, one from smallest to largest. All right, the skeletal anatomy. Two basic divisions here that we want to tell you about is going to be the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. There are 206 bones in the body here that we're going to talk about. So the axial skeleton, you can think of it as your skull, your spinal cord, and your rib cage that protects your heart and lungs, whereas the appendicular skeleton is basically your pelvis and your arms and your legs and everything that kind of goes along with them. So the actual, like I said, is the skull, all your facial bones that are together, your rib cage, thoracic cage, your vertebral column, is your spinal cord. It's what your arms and legs are basically attached to. And joints occur whenever bones come in contact with each other. They consist of the ends of the bone and the connecting and supportive tissue between them. So there are basically two types of joints that you have to know about. Number one is going to be the ball and socket joint. It allows a rotation. Think your hips and then your arms that go into your shoulder that can go in multiple directions. Whereas your hinge joint basically allows just you to flex and extend basically like your arm or your leg. But here we see a ball and socket joint and how it works. Because it has this sort of 360-degree shape, it can rotate in various different directions. As if you look at the hinge joint, it's basically one direction that you can actually move it, as you can see here. So your skull here is made up of your cranium, which is, the bones of your head, and then bones of your face. It's going to be important here are some of the major bones. So you see here the frontal bone in the front, basically your forehead, the parietal bones, which basically go over the top, and then your temporal bones, which are your temples. In the back is going to be the occipital bone. So this is the occipital region. If we were to turn this frontal view around, you would see this is the part that sticks out the back here. Now, on your face, your cheekbones are called your zygomatic bones or your zygomatic arch. That makes that nice arch here. Your maxilla are a couple of bones that are kind of fused together here, and then they come in contact with your cheekbones, your zygomas. Forms the front of your face. There's a nasal bone up here. If you break that, it's a serious injury. Normally, a broken nose is that cartilage rupture that happens, but a nasal bone takes a bit to fracture. Your eyes are your orbitals. Now, your jaw is your mandible, and there are several parts to all these bones, but you don't have to know those. But you do have to know zygoma, maxilla, mandible on these facial bones, and then this nasal bone. Now, if we look at the inferior view here, if you're looking up from the skull, kind of if you're Hamlet or something, you can see that this gigantic opening which your spinal cord comes through is called the foramen magnum, just means, big opening, basically. Your spinal column technically has 33 bones. There are 5 sections of this. Your cervical, your thoracic, your lumbar, your sacrum, or sacral vertebrae. All these are fused here. And then your coccyx, which is also fused. So it doesn't move like your thoracic spine does, for instance. So the cervical spine, or those in your neck, your thoracic spine, are those that your ribs basically attach to. Your 12 ribs, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Your lumbar is your lower back. There are 5 of these. And then there's 7 cervical vertebrae. So your thorax, like I said, there are 12 vertebrae in your thoracic spine. They correspond to your 12 ribs. If you notice down here, there are free-floating ribs that aren't actually attached completely to your rib cage by the sternum here. So basically 1 through 10 is attached. This is cartilage here in blue that it attaches to. And your sternum has several parts. So this bottom that hangs off here is your xiphoid process, this little small piece. You can feel this sternal notch at the top here. And then there's a flat bit on your sternum on the front called a manubrium. Then the body, the main part of the sternum. And this thoracic cavity, there's several organs. You're going to have your lungs out here to the side. And then your heart's basically in this area here. It extends up all the way just to about there, continues all the way down. Your lungs extend up to basically this level here. You also have your great vessels, which means your aorta, your vena cava is here, and then your esophagus as well. All right, the appendicular skeleton. Your arms, your legs, whatever connects them together, and then your pelvic girdle. So upper and lower extremities are part of this, as well as your shoulders, your hips. So the upper extremity basically extends from your pectoral girdle, your pectoral muscles, all the way to your fingertips. So your arms, your upper arm, your forearms, the bones of your hand. So there's several parts to this. There's going to be your clavicle, so your collarbone, your shoulder blades with your scapula. Now the longest bone of your upper arm here, which is the humerus. And then these 2 split bones that make up your forearm. The one on the lateral side, if we're using the anatomical view, which you can see on the skeleton here on the right side. The lateral side is your radius. We get our radial pulse over here. The medial side, which means towards the body, is going to be your ulna. Then you have all the bones of your hands and fingers. And your shoulder girdle, there are 3 bones that basically come together. Your collarbone, which is your clavicle, your shoulder blade, your scapula, and then your humerus, that upper arm bone. Your humerus is joined to this collarbone and shoulder blade together in a joint called the acromion, and it forms a joint up here between the collarbone and it called the acromioclavicular joint, your AC joint. Okay, your arm. The humerus is your longest supporting bone here. It is a long bone. So the long bones you have to worry about are going to be your femur and your humerus. Your elbow, your forearm, your radius ulna, your wrist bones, which are down here, and your finger bones ends in the phalanges, your actual fingers. So remember, your radius is on the lateral side, your ulna is on the medial side, in the anatomical position. So your hand, it's your wrist and hand here, they form ball and socket joints a lot of times. This is your wrist down here. All these bones come up together. This is your sphenoid bone here, I believe. Your metacarpals, which are going to be in basically where your palm is, the back of your hand is. All these that come up here, and then your phalanges, which are going to be your fingers, everything you see. Typically, there are going to be 3 sections of your phalanges here, except your thumb, which is 2. Your pelvic girdle. There are several bones that come together here. On the back here, it's fused with your sacrum, which is the fused lower spine here that we talked about. There's going to be basically 2 hips and several bones that form it. You can see those here. This big sweeping curve with this crest here. It's going to be your ilium. The iliac spine is just a little notch here that you can kind of feel a lot of times. Here's your iliac crest. So you can see in this other part, this red part, if you can see the back here a little bit on this picture, this is going to be your ischium. This is where you sit down in your pubic bone, formed by this little blue area called the pubic symphysis. And then your femurs come in and join at your hips in a joint called the acetabulum. If you see this side view here, you can see how they all come together. And this acetabular joint, which is like the receiving end of the ball and socket joint here, you can see how they all fuse. So you can see how this can break in older age where all these fusions are. There's all this stuff that has to come together to form your hip. So each pubic bone is formed by just fusing all these kind of bones together and making your pelvic girdle. On the back side is your sacrum and your coccyx. You can lose a lot of blood if these big bones are broken. There's a lot of bone marrow and things in there. There's also a lot of actual arteries and veins that come down. Think your femoral artery comes down here in both your legs. It comes through this area, and it branches off from your aorta down here. And you can see that here. So here's the aorta that comes down, the descending aorta. There's that vein that runs right beside it here. It's the inferior vena cava, which just means lower side. So the descending aorta, because the aorta is an artery that comes from the heart, when it goes down your body, it descends. And then the blood comes back up and ends up in your inferior vena cava. So the femur is the longest bone in the body. It is your long bones here. There's several parts to it that your book has. Like I said, there are these little outpouchings of the bone here called the lesser and greater trochanters. Those are where muscles attach, basically. Where it comes together, it makes sense that it's called the femoral neck, because the top here that inserts into that ball and socket joint, you can see how it looks like a ball. It's called the femoral neck. And the top up here where it joins the femoral head, it connects into that pelvic girdle into your acetabulum, which is that joint that runs on the other side of this pelvic head. Okay, your knee. It connects basically your femur and then your tib-fib, your tibia and fibula, or your lower legs. Your patella is your kneecap. It's this sort of arrow-shaped bone that sits on top of this. And you can see this sort of hinge joint that allows extension and flexion. This is the lateral view of it. Your shin bone is here. We'll talk later about what this little area of indention is when we start doing some other stuff. Okay, your ankle is hinge joints, and it's made up of several bones here that you don't have to memorize, but it's not up here where you normally think. It's actually down here. So you're basically tib-fib joins your foot at an ankle bone called the talus. And then that articulates with all these other bones so you can actually move your foot. Now your heel bone, that bone I will expect you to actually know the name of, that's called a calcaneus. It allows the flexion and extension of your foot here with all these ankle bones and the connection that's made with your tibia lower leg. So your tibia is going to be on the medial side and fibula is going to be on the lateral side. It's the smaller bone is the fibula, where the tibia, your shin bone basically, is going to be the bigger bone, but it is more medial than the fibula. Your phalanges are your toes. Your metatarsals are the bones of your foot, which is basically the top of your foot. So there are several tarsal bones, which basically means ankle bones. And then 5, because you have 5 toes, metatarsal bones that form the substance of the foot. It gives its structure, forms attachments and things. And then your toes are phalanges as well. So your fingers and toes are both phalanges. Overall, the skeletal system, it gives your body shape. It allows attachment points for your bones so you can actually move. It stores your calcium, which you probably already know. And then your bone marrow helps create those blood cells. All of them. White blood cells, red blood cells. All sorts of other things. So your muscles provide the form of your body, help you with posture, allows you to move, this sort of stuff. It also adds a layer of protection to your vital organs. Think of your abdomen here. There's no, rib cage for your abdomen, but part of the protection there are your abdominal muscles. There are several types of muscles. So the muscles you can move voluntarily. Think your bicep, tricep, that sort of thing. Those are skeletal muscles. Your involuntary muscles are smooth muscles and your cardiac muscle. So skeletal muscles, you can see how these look different under the microscope. You'll notice these long lines in your skeletal muscles. That's what allows the voluntary movement. These are called striations. It's striated muscle. Whereas smooth muscles, you can see it looks a lot smoother than this sort of bumpy skeletal muscle. Your involuntary muscle is smooth muscle. And then your cardiac muscle is kind of a mix between the two. You can see on this picture here. It seems like there are striations too, but it's involuntary. You'll also notice these little bridges between the skeletal muscle so that it can actually transport electrical signal in between the muscles at a faster rate. And here are your major muscle groups. So you should know your shoulders, your deltoid, your trapezius extends all the way back here as part of your back muscles. Your hamstrings are back here. Your quads are up here. It's called quads because it's actually made up of 4 muscles. You just need to know those are your quads. It's where you can get your shin splints and things if you've ever, started running long periods of time. Then your pecs. So contraction and relaxation of those muscles make it possible for you to move and to manipulate your environment. But what does happen, as you can tell, because you kind of sweat when you work out, there's a lot of heat produced when you move muscles. It's actually an important fact to know in things like seizures. So if somebody is moving involuntarily for long periods of time, they can deplete their sugar. They can get very hot. It makes them hotter because high fevers in pediatric patients can actually cause seizures. And then the seizure itself can actually raise their temperature. So like I said before, another function is just to protect those structures that are under your muscles. So respiratory anatomy, we're actually going over a more detailed lecture on Monday. So we'll skip the review for that one here. Right, your circulatory system. So it's basically a system of tubes that are connected together. And they go in this order, which you're going to have to memorize if you started arteries here. So your arteries are musculated, which means that they can actually contract by smooth muscles. When the arteries get small enough, they're called arterioles. Those arterioles get smaller and smaller until they're basically one cell layer thick. We call those capillaries. When they stop being capillaries and they start returning to the heart, we call those venules because they're small veins. And then your larger veins, take your vena cava, things like that. And that's the system that goes by. So this first part where your arteries are, because it has muscles, it's under higher pressure. And then because it's not musculated with smooth muscles, your veins and venules or a lower pressure system. There's basically two major circuits that you have to worry about. It's the systemic circuit, which means it's throughout your entire body. And then there's going to be the pulmonary circulation, which is the circulation throughout your lungs. Here's that picture again. And like I said before, you're going to have to know the actual circulation of the heart, the blood flow through the heart. So we've gone over this before, but the superior, which means on the top, all the upper body drains into the superior vena cava, and all the lower body drains into the inferior vena cava, and those both empty into the top part of your right heart called the right atrium. Now, when the blood passes through into the right ventricle, it passes through a valve in your heart to prevent backflow of the blood back into the circulation. That's called the tricuspid valve. And then it goes into the right ventricle. From there, it passes through another valve called your pulmonic semilunar valve. And from there, it actually goes into your circulatory system of your pulmonary system, so your pulmonary circulation, and pulmonary arteries, because arteries come from the heart. Whether or not the blood is oxygenated or not, blood goes through there into the actual lungs, and all these capillaries, which are around your alveoli, so gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide can occur through diffusion in your lungs, occurs. From there, it goes into the pulmonary veins because they return to the heart, and it returns with oxygenated blood. Your pulmonary veins empty into the top part of the left side of your heart. That's called your left atrium. Blood then passes through another valve, a very important one called the mitral valve. It prevents backflow from the left ventricle into the left atrium and into the pulmonary system. And you'll notice here, your left ventricle is the thickest and largest part of the heart because it's the one that actually has to contract and pump blood throughout your entire body. So after the blood enters the left ventricle, it passes through another valve called the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta, from where it goes into the rest of the body circulation before it gets picked back up into your inferior superior vena cava. So the heart is a hollow organ, and it should be because it's filled with blood. It's made up of those specialized cardiac cells that can actually beat on their own. It works together in conjunction between the right and left side and between the top and bottom. Now, each side has the upper chamber, the atrium, like I said, then the lower chamber, the ventricle. So here's a correction for Monday night because I see what they're going for here now. The heart muscle itself, because it said the heart originally, but the heart muscle so that it can actually have a blood flow of its own. As we said, diffusion can only happen through basically one cell layer thick. So the heart has to get its blood supply, and not just from the inside blood, it needs it from the actual outside blood. So what basically happens after your left ventricle, which is this area here because of the circulation, ejects blood into the aorta during diastole. When your left ventricle actually relaxes, the blood kind of rests up against that aortic semilunar valve, and the gravity itself can help actually filter that through into these coronary arteries, which feed throughout the entire heart. So the heart is the first organ that gets blood from itself. So the filling of these actual arteries occurs during diastole when it's at rest because there's lower enough pressure for it to actually get into these arteries, and it doesn't just push it all past into the circulation of the body itself. So after diastole occurs, the blood kind of starts flowing through these coronary arteries and feeds the heart itself. Now, when you have a heart attack, what happens is these coronary arteries themselves become blocked, and that's why your heart muscle dies, because it can't get its oxygen and nutrients and get rid of its waste just from the blood that's inside the left ventricle or the right ventricle because it's too thick. It needs its own blood supply. So this is your right atrium here. If you've ever actually seen a real heart, it does kind of look like this, just a little tiny bit here. So the right side of your heart gets deoxygenated blood. Doesn't mean that there's no oxygen whatsoever in it, but it does mean it's less than what you would want for your whole body circulation for it to actually offload onto your tissues. So it's deoxygenated blood. It gets that from your body. And the left side receives oxygenated blood from your lungs. So it can actually give it to the rest of your body. And here's another picture that shows the same thing. As it says here, the right side is the lower pressure side. And the reason for that is because you can see how much more muscular the left ventricle is in comparison with the right. So since it can't contract as hard, and basically it doesn't need to because it only needs to go to the lungs, it doesn't need to go to the rest of your body. It's a thinner muscle wall. So it's a stronger part of the heart on the left side. So you really need that left side. All right, your normal resting heart rate, which means, the patient hasn't had to walk. They're not under a great deal of stress. That normal rate is 60 to 100 beats a minute. So there's several terms here which they list in your book. I'll try and tell you about them. So your stroke volume. That is going to be the amount of blood the left ventricle actually moves with every beat. In one beat, the amount of blood in milliliters that the left ventricle can actually move. Now, your cardiac output is the amount of blood that left ventricle moves within 1 minute. So if we can figure out what the normal heart rate is and what the normal stroke volume is, we can actually figure out how much blood moves throughout the body normally. So obviously, if your heart rate is too high or too low, that's going to change. But a normal heart rate is about 75 beats a minute, 80 beats a minute. And a normal stroke volume is something like 75 milliliters per beat. So if we figure out what your heart rate is per minute, we can figure out the amount of blood moved per minute, which is your cardiac output. And it comes out to about 5 liters, which is approximately the total amount of blood in your body. So if you get hit in the heart, you're going to die approximately within 1 minute. If it's not working correctly, the same thing can happen. The electrical conduction system of the heart, I think we'll go over this later, but just know that these are specialized tissues in your heart. So like we said earlier, where it goes from cells to tissues to actual organs, and several kinds of tissues make up an organ. Well, this is one of the kinds of tissues that make up the heart. It basically conducts chemical electricity, so a charge from one side of your heart to the other. Now, that charge causes your muscles to contract in a coordinated way, so it's not all haphazard. It's actually where the top of your heart beats and then the bottom of your heart beats, so it makes that coordination possible so that your blood can actually move the way it needs to go. So it'll start in the top right atrium of your heart and it'll move down through your ventricles. So if you remember when we were doing CPR, we put those AD pads at the top near the, basically right shoulder almost to the bottom left flank. And the reason is that's the way your electricity moves. In your heart, it starts at the top and goes to the bottom. And then it goes back up. So it discharges and then it recharges everything. And then it discharges and recharges. So the top of your heart beats first when it's discharging, and then that discharges the bottom of your heart, and then it recharges the other way. This reduces the actual pumping of your blood throughout your body and into your lungs. So your arteries, there's several of these. They conduct blood away from the heart and eventually to all the body tissues. Now, these are your pulse points here, but there are several branches to your aorta which actually come out. So you can see some of these. There are these 3 branches that come off the aorta. So one feeds basically the left arm, one feeds the right arm and the right side of your neck, and then one feeds the left side of your neck, and these go up to the brain. These are your carotid arteries, where we get your carotid pulse. And then you can see here different branches of the aorta feeds different arms. So this brachial pulse means arm, brachial means arm. And then you should be used now to actually taking a radial pulse here on your wrist. There's actually that femoral pulse, basically in your pelvic girdle area that I showed you before. And then there's going to be your foot pulses, and there are 2 of these. And we'll show you these in the lab here a little later. So your aorta branches off and feeds your body. There are several major arteries throughout your body. Your aorta, certainly those coronary arteries which feed the heart, which we talked about, and then arteries in your liver and your kidneys, and then actually in your gut called the mesenteric arteries. So the pulmonary arteries, which go from basically your right ventricle into your lungs, that carries oxygen, which is pretty much depleted. It's not zero. It's actually pretty high, but it needs to take on more oxygen. It carries that to the lungs, and then your arteries there and basically everywhere in your body are going to branch into smaller arteries and then into the arterioles, and that branches into a series of smaller vessels that we call the capillaries. And it looks like this. So I showed you a little graph with the arrows where one goes to the others. So your aorta, which is your biggest artery, will become smaller as it goes throughout your body, and those arteries will get even smaller, called arterioles. And then it's all going to branch into a capillary bed where gas exchange occurs, waste products are picked up, nutrients are dropped off, because these are the smallest actual blood vessels, so they can be the thinnest where diffusion can actually occur. And then they'll get bigger and turn into venules, which are small veins. And then those will enter into the biggest vein called the vena cava, either the superior or inferior vena cava. So pulses. So they're palpated most easily at the neck, which are these carotid pulses, which we've shown you. The wrist, which are these radial pulses, or the femoral. Okay, which is that pulse in the groin that I showed you. It's basically in the fold area of your groin. And they're created by forceful pumping of blood because the arteries have that smooth muscle around it, which can constrict and make the pressure higher in the arteries. So it's a forceful pumping of blood out of the left ventricle into those major arteries here that we can actually pick up as pulses. So your capillaries, which this is your capillary bed, how it branches off. It's the one that has the most branches in it, a very fine ends division of the artery system. So they allow contact between the blood and cells because they're so thin where diffusion can actually take place. Now the veins return that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And just know that the superior vena cava drains blood from the top side of your body. So the head, the neck, the shoulders, your upper arms. While the inferior vena cava gets it from the bottom of your body, your lower extremities, both your legs, basically, your abdomen, your pelvis. And both of those join and drain into your right atrium. All right, the spleen. So I told you, your spleen is behind your stomach. So in this little view here, this thing here, if you can notice, this is your stomach. Here's your esophagus. And here's your stomach. And behind that is this little organolymphatic system called the spleen. It stores blood as well. So if you need a little bit of extra blood, your spleen can actually put that in circulation if it needs it. It also filters the blood. And it is susceptible to injury from blood trauma. So think baseball bats to the left side of your body, or particularly atrocious, vicious football hits can actually rupture the spleen. And then also car wrecks can cause the spleen to actually split and rupture and lacerate it, which means cut it. All right. There are two patients that I told you about that are particularly susceptible to injury from that sort of trauma. It's going to be young patients, pediatrics, and then typically alcoholics because their spleen is bigger. Blood is made up of a couple of different things. The three components you need to know about is the plasma, which is this straw-colored bit at the top here. It makes up most of your blood, 55% here. Your white blood cells, which is the lowest percentage of blood, it's less than a percentage of your blood is white blood cells. That's what fights infection. They're also called leukocytes. Cyte means cell. Go to the white blood cells. Cyte means cell, and leuko means white. Your red blood cells make up approximately 45%. You can think of those as the ones that carry oxygen. It's called erythrocyte cell, and then erythro red. You also have platelets, which are the things that form clot. Those are little components that used to be full cells and they're basically broken off so that we can make clots. So your blood pressure is the pressure of your blood that is actually forced against the walls of your arteries. So if you think of this as an artery, your actual blood pressure is going to be the hydrostatic pressure, which basically means the pressure the fluid actually presses and actually gives you the amount of pressure that the fluid makes when it's in a certain sized artery or your aorta. It depends on certain things, but that's your hydrostatic pressure. It's called here the blood hydrostatic pressure. It basically means your blood pressure. All right. So that's pressure that's pushed against the walls of this artery as blood is forced through. So systole is when the left ventricle contracts, this top number of your blood pressure, whereas diastole is when your left ventricle kind of relaxes and the ventricle fills with blood. It fills with blood because it relaxes. So it's not pumping, it relaxes, it gets a little bigger, then it contracts again, forces blood through your aorta to the rest of your body, and causes your blood pressure. So the systolic blood pressure is a high point of the wave. Your diastolic is low. So it's usually rendered as 120/80, and then it's given as a unit of millimeters of mercury, mm, capital Hg, because Hg on the periodic table is mercury. That's how we measure the pressure. So your blood pressure is adjusted and controlled by your body without you thinking about it, because there needs to be a lot of micro controls to make sure that those capillaries can actually get the blood that it needs. So there's several terms here. One is perfusion. So that's basically the blood that's circulating around, and it can actually get to the organ of the tissue and the amount that tissue needs to be able to get the oxygen and nutrients it needs and actually offload all the waste products that it needs. So if you have low perfusion or hypoperfusion, that just means the blood is inadequately supplied to whatever tissues or cells it needs to get to. If this hypoperfusion gets too bad, it's a condition we call shock. We'll learn about that later in a couple of weeks. So inadequate circulation. So your blood system, the circulatory system, it can actually adjust pretty well to small amounts of blood loss, which is why you can get blood. You can get that pint of blood basically, and your body can actually, adjust to that blood loss. So several things can happen. It can cause those vessels, those arteries to actually constrict a bit more. That'll raise the pressure, even though the fluid's lower. If you put more pressure on it, the blood pressure is going to go up. And then if your heart pumps faster so that more blood comes out of your left ventricle, it means that there's more fluid, more blood in your actual circulatory system, and that will cause your blood pressure to actually go up as well. But if you lose a large amount of blood, what's going to happen is these things where your vessels constrict and the increased heart rate, the tachycardia happens. Eventually what's going to happen is these systems are going to fail because it's not normal. They don't happen all the time. And then you're going to go into shock. So your book mentions this. To actually detect shock, you can use the average arterial pressure, what we call a MAP. And there is a formula to this, but think of it as kind of the average point of the pressure. If you take 120/80 and sort of average that out with the formula, you can actually help detect shock by that. The reason is because if your average pressure is below 65 millimeters of mercury, your blood won't, your brain will not get enough blood, which is why shock happens. Your brain doesn't get enough blood, you start to get confused, you pass out, and you eventually die because those brain cells will die if it doesn't get enough blood, it doesn't get enough glucose. So the functions of the blood, there are several of them. Your white blood cells fight the infection. Your red blood cells actually give your tissues oxygen. To get rid of waste products, it'll take that carbon dioxide away. If your pH is off, your body will actually control that through the blood and something called the buffering system. So if you've had chemistry before, this is basically the buffering system formula. What's going on here is acid, which are hydrogen ions, and this base called bicarbonate will actually eventually turn into carbon dioxide and water. So that way, that's why carbon dioxide is a waste product, because if your body has too much acid, it turns it into carbon dioxide, and gets rid of it. So that in that way it gets rid of acid. There's a little more to that in this, but that's basically what happens. Now, your blood also transports those wasted nutrients, like we said, and allows clotting, because in your plasma, the clotting factors, the things that cause your blood to actually clot, are transported. So your blood will actually help form clots in coagulation. Your nervous system. So there are several main parts. We'll talk about the sympathetic first. So you can think of main branches of the nervous system, different types of nerves. What basically happens is your nerves will use different kinds of chemicals to communicate with each other. And your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for your fight or flight. The sort of, a lion standing in front of you, you start to get excited, that sort of stuff. What happens is your nervous system will send commands to your endocrine system, here the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. And those adrenal glands will actually release hormones that cause you to be more hyperactive. Basically, it increases things like heart rate, so you get tachycardic, and your blood pressure will increase because your actual arteries will constrict because of these hormones. And those are called epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline, because it comes from your adrenal glands. So your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response system. So your blood vessels, basically your small arteries and things throughout your body, actually have receptors. They call those alpha receptors. So your alpha receptors actually get epinephrine and norepinephrine from your bloodstream. And it can attach to those and cause your muscles to do things like constrict, because it attaches to certain receptors. So you can think the receptors is basically a lock, and the epinephrine is the key that turns the lock, that makes those smooth muscles do things. And in this case, it'll make them actually constrict. Your heart also has some receptors, and your lungs have receptors, which your sympathetic nervous system, by using epinephrine and norepinephrine, actually uses. Those are called beta receptors. Now, don't get lost in this adrenergic word here. Adrenergic is just a synonym, basically. You can think of it as sympathetic. So, if we look at the next slide, it's basically alpha sympathetic receptors. That's not the most accurate, but you can think of it that way in EMT class. So your heart and lungs also have receptors for epinephrine, and so do your blood vessels. That's the thing to take away from here. Your blood vessels, your heart and lungs respond to your sympathetic nervous system. Your body also has baroreceptors, which baro just, means pressure. So it's pressure receptors, either high or low, in your blood vessels, and some of those are in your neck. I talked about in class people passing out from doing a power clean. This is a power clean. So your carotid arteries have baroreceptors, and if you actually put pressure on those, it can, because your carotid artery baroreceptors think that the blood pressure is too high, because you've actually started pressing this weightlifting bar on your neck. It'll cause your heart rate to fall rapidly, and you'll pass out because there's not enough blood getting to your brain until you actually fall to the ground. And this happens with people because some people's baroreceptors in their carotid arteries are more sensitive than others. So people that are doing these power cleans, this weight lifting where it's close to the neck and maybe they're not doing it the most correct, can actually trigger those baroreceptors and cause them to pass out. But it's important to know, when we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, which uses epinephrine and norepinephrine, the fight or flight system, that there's an opposite side to that. A system that sort of slows you down. That's called the parasympathetic system. But they're both valuable, and your body uses them both, and it needs to use them both for different things, and they kind of balance each other out. And even more than that, I'll say they actually work together. So your nervous system is very complex. All right. So we talked about sympathetic and parasympathetic, and we may come back to that here in a second. But the main divisions of your actual nervous system is your central and peripheral nervous system. So you can think of parasympathetic and sympathetic as different kinds of nerves that make up your nervous system, whether it's peripheral or central. So your central nervous system is your brain. Think your spinal cord. That's your central nervous system. Whereas your peripheral nervous system is actually everything else. It's everything else that comes off your spinal cord It's the nerves that where you can actually feel things in your hands, your sense of touch. That's your peripheral nervous system. And this is further divided into two other parts. So the main two parts are going to be your central, your brain and spinal cord, and then every other nerve. And those every other nerves are divided into two parts. Either the parts you can control in your nerves, think about moving your arm, or the things you can't control in your nerves. Think about sensing touch or sensing temperature. Those are called autonomic. Think of them as like automatic almost. You just sense them. Whereas your somatic nerves, you can actually control your somatic nerves. So your central nervous system, brain, spinal cord, your brain is made up of several parts. So your cerebrum, you can think of that as where you think. That works. It does a lot of things. It controls some hormones. It actually has your memories, but it's also where you can feel pain. There's several things that it does. A lot of things. It's the biggest part of your brain because it has so many functions. Now your cerebellum is this little shape back here. Your cerebellum, the main thing you should be concerned about is it helps actually with your balance and coordination. So if you drink a lot of alcohol and you start falling down, the reason is because your cerebellum is affected. And then the last part is basically your brain stem. Think of like the earliest part of your brain. It has several parts to it. This little outpouching here is called the pons. And then there's the medulla oblongata. It's longer. And then midbrain. There's several parts. Now your CSF, your cerebrospinal fluid, is a fluid that surrounds your spinal cord and brain, and it protects you from things like slight head bumps, and it protects against friction where your actual skull inside of there, where your brain can hit it. It gives it a little protective cushion from that, from slight traumas. The circulation in your head, the oxygenated blood comes from those main arteries in your neck called the carotid arteries. They run on both sides of your neck. You have two of them. And the deoxygenated blood that's drained from your brain comes out of your internal and external jugular veins. And those also run down your neck. Your spinal cord, it's an extension that just comes straight off your brainstem. It comes through that foramen magnum. Like we said, it transmits your messages from your brain to your body. So it runs down that entire length, and then a whole bunch of nerves branch off from it. So the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system transmits signals from your brain into the muscles that you can actually think about controlling yourself. The muscles of your arms and legs, the muscles that make you speak. So the somatic nervous system is voluntary. It's a transmission system from brain to muscle. It's voluntary. Whereas your autonomic system is involuntary. It also comes from your brain, but it can actually be sensory systems and things like that. But the involuntary part, this autonomic nervous system, if you thought there were too many parts of the nervous system already, be prepared for two other splits. So we already talked about the sympathetic nervous system. That's part of your involuntary system, your autonomic system. So, a bit of a review. There are two main branches to your nervous system. The central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system. All right? So take your peripheral nervous system, and that has more actual branches off of that. And those are the somatic and autonomic, whether or not it's voluntary, involuntary, voluntary somatic, involuntary autonomic. And then you can think of the autonomic as split into two other parts. It's the sympathetic, which has that epinephrine, norepinephrine thing that speeds you up, your fight or flight. And then it has a parasympathetic, which slows you down, what they call the feed and breathe. So if you're digesting food, that's working off your parasympathetic system. Because if you think about it, if there's a lion standing in front of you, you don't really need to digest food. So it actually will shunt blood. It'll like cut off blood supply a little bit to your intestines because you don't have to digest food right then. And so you're not going to be digesting as well when you're in the sympathetic system. But if your body slows down, you can actually start digesting that food a little better because you have some time. You're not having to flee or fight something. So there are two types of nerves within the peripheral nervous system. Sensory nerves, you feel things. Sense and touch, think of that. And then motor nerves, nerves that connect to your muscles from your brain. All right, your skin, three main parts here that you have to know. The top layer is epidermis. That sits on top, hence epi, on top of your dermis. And then your dermis kind of sits with some connective tissue here to a subcutaneous layer. So those are your three layers. The top again is epidermis, and then dermis, and then your subcu layer. The subcu layer has fat cells, nerves, blood supply starts from there. And then your dermal layer, which has your actual oil glands, your hair follicles, and your epidermis, which is mostly just made up of dead dermis cells. Your skin is the largest single organ in the body. So it has three functions, which you should know. One, it protects the body from the environment. Basically, think of things like bacteria in the environment that can actually infect your body, cause you to be sick. It protects you from that. It protects you from other things like just rain. But it also regulates your body temperature. So think about sweating, but it also keeps in heat. So if you think about it like this, if your skin actually regulates your body temperature, if your patient gets burns that burn through your epidermis and dermis, it can't regulate its body temperature anymore. It'll lose a lot of heat, even though they've just been burned. And then they can die of hypothermia, low body temperature. It'll also help to transmit that information from things like touch and then sense of temperature from the environment to the brain. Your GI system is the system that actually digests and excretes the food that you eat. It's the second, it has your abdomen, your second major body cavity. The other is going to be your mediastinum, which houses basically your heart. Your abdomen in medicine is divided into 4 sections. And very cleverly, they named these quadrants, and this one up here, because it's the anatomical position, is your right upper quadrant, or excuse me, your left upper quadrant. Below that is your left lower quadrant. And then your right lower quadrant, which has your appendix in it. Your right upper quadrant, which has your liver in it. Your left upper quadrant has your stomach and your spleen. And then your left lower quadrant has intestines. So, when we start getting in medicine, it's important to know these quadrants and where the actual organs are, because where the patient actually describes their pain will tell you which organ may be involved here. That gets more complicated in females, but in most people, if they say things like they hurt in their right lower quadrant, and they point to that area, it could be something like appendicitis. Or if they have pain that comes from their right upper quadrant, it could be something wrong with their liver. They might have gallstones from their gallbladder. So this sort of body anatomy where we separate this will help you figure out what the problem is in these patients. It's made up of several parts. Obviously, it starts in the mouth. All right, there's salivary glands there. It helps break down carbs. Your oropharynx, which is in the back of your throat here, it's your pharynx. Your esophagus, stomach, pancreas. Your pancreas will actually secrete enzymes which help break down fats. That's called lipase. It'll actually secrete bicarbonate, which we talked about in the acid system. When it mixes with acid, it forms water and carbon dioxide. So it secretes this bicarbonate, which is a base, to neutralize the acid in your large intestine as soon as it gets from your stomach, so that it doesn't eat through your small intestines. Your liver will make bile. Your gallbladder will actually store it and then secrete it through some bile ducts. Your bile actually, what they call emulsifies fat, which means it takes, think of a large amount of fat, then it'll take that and break it up into smaller pieces for digestion. Your small intestine will actually get nutrients from your body. Your large intestine is what actually collects and actually solidifies your fecal matter. Your appendix is just an extra uh, piece of your intestine that we no longer use. Cows use it, things like that. And then your rectum. So we go back and talk about our appendix here. Think about things. So what happens is your small intestine is connected to your large intestine in an opening here right at the bottom. So when we get to medicine, we'll start talking about appendicitis. So if you think about it, when the food comes through, if you don't have a high fiber diet, which can actually help your intestines to move this food around, when it comes in a large intestine, it can just sit there, and this fecal matter can fall into your appendix and cause appendicitis. So be sure and eat your fiber if you have not had an appendectomy yet. Okay, it's, like I said, it adds enzymes to food, so it can actually break down these larger actually chunks of nutrients into basic sugars, fatty acids, and then amino acids, which make up proteins. From your small intestine, the actual blood flow goes straight to your liver, which can process all these things that come from your food. And the circulation then goes to the rest of your body and distributes these nutrients that your body needs. All right, your lymphatic system. So if you didn't actually know about this lymphatic system, it's quite extensive. So if you've ever had an infection or a serious illness where your lymph nodes actually get swollen, a lot of times in kids especially, they'll get swollen in your neck because, I mean, look how many there are. Your spleen is part of this. Like I said on Monday, this is basically the waste disposal system of the body. It's connected to your blood. So there's actual lymph fluid in here. It's a straw-colored fluid. It circulates things from your blood so that it can actually clean out the things that your body doesn't need. So if there are small amounts of cancer cells that you don't even know about, and they can actually circulate into your lymph nodes and it can destroy them. If there's a lot of it, these lymph nodes will actually become infested with cancer cells. And this is called a lymphoma. If you've ever heard of anyone that's had lymphoma before, you can see where like a lot of this stuff happens. Places like armpits, they'll develop lumps. They'll develop lumps here in their groin area, up here in their neck. There's several other things besides your spleen. There's something called a thymus, which basically doesn't exist anymore in adults. Your thymus will actually help your white blood cells to mature when you're a child. Like I said, there is this thin straw-colored fluid here. It carries oxygen, nutrients to cells, and waste products away from them. It helps to rid toxins and other harmful material from your body so that your body can actually excrete this stuff. Your endocrine system. So these are your hormones. Your hormones are a messenger system, and they control system for your body. So think of it as your endocrine system is your thermostat. All right, it integrates. It brings together all the different actual body functions. So your endocrine system interacts between your muscles and your nerves, for instance, between your lungs and your heart, all sorts of stuff from your hormones, between your kidneys and your lungs. It actually helps with the endocrine system. Your hormones are released in your bloodstream and they travel around. Now, like we said before, if you think about a cardiac output, the amount of blood actually expelled from your left ventricle in 1 minute, I said, is basically the total amount of your body fluid. So if your actual like hormone, like tissues, release a hormone from your endocrine system, it only takes about a minute to get to where it needs to go. All right. So it can happen fast, which is why this fight or flight stuff can happen really fast for you. So your brain, basically, for most of these, actually controls the release. There is a sort of cascading action that happens from where one hormone causes another one to be released, but it basically starts in your brain. And there are various diseases which we'll go through in class where they have too much and too little hormone can actually cause them to have bad diseases. The urinary system. So it actually discharges waste from the body that's filtered through the kidneys. Basically, what happens is your blood flows through your kidneys. Your kidneys take up that waste and get rid of it. It can be things like too much salt. That sort of stuff is actually released from the kidneys, and because it actually releases the salt and potassium and all these like salts from your body, it actually helps control the fluid balance in your body. So if you don't have enough fluid in your body and you're dehydrated, for instance, it's going to be hard to actually make urine. So it filters and eliminates various waste from your body, one of them being urea, and that is in your urine. It also helps control your pH balance as well, because it can get rid of those hydrogen ions that cause like acid. There are several parts to your kidneys collect this urine in things called collecting ducts. Then all those come together into a bigger actual collection tube called a ureter, which dumps into your bladder, which is the storage area. And then from there, it's actually ejected from the body. Male anatomy. There's several things here, if you didn't know about them from school or basic biology class here. So the testicles here have this thing on top called an epididymis on top, epi, right? So it's on top of the testicles, and it runs through a tube called the vas deferens. All right. And then it actually comes from the prostate gland. These seminal vesicles, like, just so you, the reason for this, obviously seminal semen, right? So your testicles make most of your sperm, but some of it is made in the seminal vesicle here. And they pass through this vas deferens, which connects all this stuff together. And then your prostate gland's in the middle there. Your urethra is where basically your urine comes out to, by the way. It comes from the kidneys, and both these are connected together. The female reproductive system, this is the one because EMTs, especially EMT students, are mostly male. They don't have very much experience with actually studying things like the menstrual cycle and the female anatomy. So your vagina is actually the birth canal. So it's inside the woman. From there, it actually passes through the cervix, this opening here. The actual opening down here where this line is pointing is the cervical opening. It's called a cervical os, cervical os, cervical os. There's a cervical canal here, which connects into her uterus. And you see how muscular this uterus is? That's because they have to pass babies through here, and it has to push them out into this birth canal. So it's a very muscular organ. Even when they're not carrying a child, it becomes bigger when they are. Now, the ovary actually has eggs in it. And on their cycle, it expels one egg from one of these ovaries, and it ejects it out, and it's caught by these finger-like projections here that they call fimbriae, or fimbri. Now, this is all connected together with a ligament here, which gives it this shape, which is why it actually maintains this shape, because ligaments maintain shape. And it's actually from the fimbri, the egg travels down this fallopian tube into the uterus where it should be implanted normally. If it's implanted someplace else, that's a problem. And there's all sorts of problems that can occur within here. Endometriosis is a thickening of this lining here that causes pain and difficulty actually getting pregnant. And there's all sorts of other things that can actually happen within both the male and the female anatomy here for the reproductive system that we're actually going to have to learn about. Yes. So in this picture, we'll go over this in OB. This top part here, this little dome, is called a fundus. All cells in the body require oxygen, nutrients, and it has to remove the waste products because some of these waste products are acid. So you got to get rid of acid from your body. It's a byproduct just of your metabolism normally. It carries all those supplies and waste throughout the body into where it needs to be excreted, either through your urine or from your lungs, etc. If something happens where these waste products can't be taken away and the nutrients can't be given, think of things like in a cardiac arrest where your heart stops, all your cells eventually get damaged and die, which is why it's important to early on actually correct that and restore blood flow to the body of these people that are in cardiac arrest. So your cells use oxygen and nutrients, particularly glucose, into chemical energy through metabolism, which is your basic bodily functions. Okay, if it's aerobic metabolism, it uses oxygen. This is what normally happens, and it's much more efficient to use oxygen than to not. So it's important to attempt to maintain aerobic metabolism, because if you think about it, if you don't breathe, you die because you don't get oxygen. The reason is because actual metabolism without oxygen, called anaerobic, and without oxygen metabolism, what happens is acids build up, and then your body can't function, and it can't remove all that waste because there's too much waste coming together too quickly. So you want to make sure your patients get oxygen and can maintain good aerobic metabolism, a process we call homeostasis. So the life support chain. So make sure you know this. The movement of oxygen and waste occurs by diffusion, which is just basically moving of molecules, okay, from a from a high concentration to a low concentration is what diffusion is. So if there's a lot of things on one side and not a lot of things on the other, they'll move out so they're evenly spread out. In order to do this, your pH has to be within the normal range of the human body. So a lot of your energy just goes to maintaining that pH so all your chemical processes and your metabolism can keep going on, which is why it's a lot better to have aerobic or oxygen metabolism. Patho. Patho is the function that it changes when the body reacts to a disease. It's basically what happens when things start to fail. Okay, so respiratory compromise. There's various different ways to actually synonyms here to compromise: distress, respiratory rest, whatever. But respiratory compromise is the inability of the body to actually move a gas effectively. So whether oxygen or carbon dioxide. So some of these things can happen. So you can have low blood O2, so low oxygen amounts in your blood. We call that low oxygen. If it's low oxygen in the tissues, it's called hypoxemia. But you can also have in your blood too much carbon dioxide, which we call that hyper or high carbia. Carbon dioxide is carbia. So hypercarbia is too much carbon dioxide in your blood, and that's bad. It happens in people that are smokers, people that have COPD, that sort of stuff. It's a lung and blood problem. Factors that impair ventilation. You can think of things like choking. If something falls on your chest and you're unable to actually move your chest into the normal length and actually breathe in and breathe out normally, you can think of being crushed like that. It can impair the muscles themselves. Also, certain diseases can do this. One we'll learn about is called myasthenia gravis. Your airway can actually be obstructed, which means blocked just by your physiology because of things like asthma. So if you have like inflammation in your bronchioles, that is too great. Oxygen can't move in there because of the asthma, and you have to relieve that constriction, or those people, like, unfortunately, may pass away. There are some other factors. If you have a drug overdose or an allergic reaction, you can also impair ventilation. A change in atmosphere where there's not enough oxygen in the atmosphere. Think of things like if there's a fire, there's not a lot of oxygen there. If you're at a higher altitude, especially over something like 6,000 meters, the air is thinner. It doesn't mean there's less oxygen in there. It just means there's less air total. So there's still 21% oxygen, whether you're at sea level or the top of Everest. But since there's not a lot of air around to breathe at all, that 21% means less oxygen molecules, even though it's the same percentage in the air. And then there can actually be impaired movement of gas across cell membranes or between cells because of things like too much swelling around the area.